The internet is currently obsessed with a phantom document. If you want forensic analysis grounded in absolute fact, I highly recommend you subscribe and join us as we look at the reality of this case. The authorities carefully documented the red stain, knowing that this single drop of fluid held more truth than any silence camera ever could. It was a stark reminder of the violence that had unfolded in the shadows. The suspect had meticulously planned their attire, their approach, and their weapon. They had successfully identified and exploited the massive geographic blind spots of the Tucson foothills. They had even managed to defeat the modern technology designed to catch them. Yet in the chaotic moments of the actual abduction, human error prevailed. Biology trumped preparation. The invisible ghost had bled or had caused the victim to bleed, leaving behind a microscopic map that investigators desperately hoped would lead them straight to the captor. The forensic team carefully collected the biological material from the porch and rushed it to the laboratory. The entire investigation hinged on what the microscopes would reveal about that single red smear. The truth of this investigation is far more complex and significantly more frustrating than any online conspiracy theory could ever capture. When the initial results came back, they confirmed the worst fears of the family and the authorities. The laboratory definitively matched the genetic markers in the blood to Nancy Guthrie. The violence implied by the doorbell camera footage was now a confirmed physical reality. She had been injured during the abduction. For an elderly woman, dependent on daily medication and a pacemaker, any physical trauma was a ticking clock. But the laboratory report contained a secondary finding that completely shifted the trajectory of the entire case. This is the exact moment where the reality of forensic science violently clashes with the rapid-fire expectations of internet detectives. The blood on the porch was not just a pure sample belonging to the victim. The analysts discovered that the biological evidence was deeply contaminated. It was a highly complex mixed DNA profile. Alongside the genetic material of the 84-year-old victim, the scientists detected the presence of foreign DNA. The authorities did not miss a suspect profile on day 79. Furthermore, the crime scene technicians had recovered an unidentified hair sample from the immediate vicinity of the struggle. The authorities had essentially found the biological signature of the masked suspect. They had the genetic code of the person wearing the Ozark Trail backpack. But having the code and being able to read it are two entirely different forensic realities. A mixed DNA profile is not a straightforward fingerprint. It is a microscopic knot of intertwined genetic information. The perpetrator's cells were hopelessly entangled with the victim's cells, creating a chaotic biological puzzle that local laboratories simply did not have the computational power or the advanced technology to untangle. If you appreciate this level of deep scientific analysis, please hit the like button so we know to keep delivering these forensic breakdowns. This was the severe forensic snag that the Pima County Sheriff's Department had warned the public about. Instead, the investigation hit a very real, very scientific brick wall much earlier in the timeline. This was the crucial detail that every online forum was completely ignoring. The investigation was not stalling because investigators lacked evidence. It was stalling because the evidence they had was too complex for standard processing. The local authorities had to package the mixed DNA samples and the unidentified hair and shipped them across the country to a highly specialized Federal Bureau of Investigation laboratory facility in Florida. The case transitioned from a local ground search to a high-stakes federal science experiment. The detectives in Tucson were now forced to wait on the meticulous, slow-moving gears of advanced genetic extraction. The internet wanted immediate arrest and perfectly typed out suspect profiles. They wanted the satisfaction of a rapidly closed case. Instead, the reality was a team of federal scientists in white coats staring at compromised biological material, trying to mathematically separate the victim from the monster. The Pima County Sheriff's Department officially confirmed they are facing a severe forensic snag. The invisible signature was locked inside a microscopic vault, and the only key was time. It was a brutal waiting game. The suspect was out there breathing, moving, hiding behind their mask, while their own biology sat in a federal lab, slowly giving up its secrets. But the agonizing pace of the scientific process created a massive vacuum of information back in Tucson. And in high-profile cases, when authorities go silent and the science takes over, human nature abhors the void. People demand answers. And when the truth is locked in a laboratory, the public will inevitably begin to invent their own. The desperation for a quick resolution completely blinded the outside observers to the incredible difficulty of what the Florida laboratory was attempting to achieve. Separating a mixed profile requires isolating specific alleles and running countless statistical probabilities to ensure the resulting genetic string belongs exclusively to the unknown suspect and not the victim or a random environmental contaminant. It is a painstaking, delicate procedure where a single error can destroy the entire sample. The authorities knew that rushing this process would jeopardize the only solid lead they possessed. A tiny microscopic mistake left behind on a quiet front porch has become a biological puzzle so intricate they were holding a microscopic lottery ticket, but they had to wait months for the numbers to be slowly revealed. This agonizing delay, this necessary scientific patience, was about to ignite a firestorm of misplaced suspicion and completely derail the public discourse surrounding the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. While the federal laboratory in Florida was painstakingly attempting to untangle the mixed DNA profile, the boots on the ground in Arizona were growing increasingly desperate. The days were slipping by, and every passing hour significantly diminished the chances of finding an 84-year-old cardiac patient alive. The local investigators scoured the desert landscape surrounding the Catalina foothills, expanding their search grids wider and wider in hopes of finding any physical object dropped by the fleeing suspect. The digital trail was dead and the biological trail was stalled in a lab. They desperately needed a tangible physical lead. And then miles away from the quiet porch where the abduction occurred, they found something that seemed to break the case wide open. Approximately 2 miles away from the Guthrie residence, search teams located a discarded dart glove that it is currently stalling the entire operation at a federal laboratory facility down in Florida. The discovery immediately sent shockwaves through the investigation and the media. The security footage from the doorbell camera had clearly shown the masked intruder wearing dark gloves while disabling the lens. Finding a matching physical item just 2 miles away along a potential escape route felt like the massive breakthrough everyone had been praying for. The internet sleuth seized upon this detail, instantly weaving it into their rapidly expanding web of theories. The glove was held up as the ultimate proof of a clumsy, panicked suspect who was shedding evidence as they fled the scene. It seemed entirely plausible. An armed kidnapper carrying a 25-liter backpack and dragging a hostage would naturally make mistakes in the dark desert terrain. The authorities immediately secured the glove, treating it as a prime piece of forensic evidence. They rushed it through the independent DNA testing protocols, hoping against hope that the inside of the fabric would yield skin cells or sweat belonging to the man in the ski mask. If they could pull a clean, single-source DNA profile from this glove, they could completely bypass the agonizing wait for the mixed DNA results from Florida. The public is busy looking for a villain in a fictionalized document while the real investigators are fighting a desperate war on a cellular level. This dark piece of fabric represented a shortcut to the truth. The entire community held its breath, waiting for the laboratory to confirm that the invisible ghost had finally slipped up. The forensic technicians swabbed the interior linings, carefully extracting the biological material left behind by the wearer. They ran the genetic sequencing, and the results came back remarkably fast. Unlike the chaotic, entangled mess found on the front porch, the DNA profile pulled from the glove was beautifully clean and perfectly readable. It was a complete genetic string. The investigators took this pristine profile and ran it through their databases, bracing for a match that would finally put a name to the ski mask. But forensic science does not care about narrative convenience. The results returned, and the clean genetic string did not point to a mastermind kidnapper. It did not point to a violent home invader with a tactical backpack. This is not a case of bureaucratic negligence or ignored clues. The DNA profile belonged to a completely innocent employee who worked at a restaurant located near where the glove was found. The worker had simply dropped their own dark glove while commuting or taking out the trash. It was a completely random piece of environmental debris that happened to vaguely resemble the clothing worn by the suspect. The massive breakthrough was nothing more than a cruel geographical coincidence. The independent testing had worked flawlessly, but it had provided the perfect answer to the completely wrong question. The only physical lead they had found outside the crime scene instantly evaporated. The glove was completely useless to the investigation. The local detectives were forced to close that file and look back at the quiet house in the foothills, realizing they were exactly where they started. The massive letdown of the glove discovery emphasized a terrifying reality. The alleged intruder had not made any sloppy, physical mistakes during their escape. This is a case where the science of crime scene processing is being pushed to its absolute. They had not panicked. They had not left a trail of breadcrumbs through the desert. The only mistake they had made was the microscopic exchange of fluids on the porch. The authorities were once again completely, entirely dependent on the federal laboratory in Florida. The shortcut was a dead end. The failure of the glove lead sent a wave of profound frustration rippling through the investigation team. They had invested precious time and resources chasing a ghost artifact. This complete collapse of a promising physical clue served to amplify the intense pressure building around the case. The public, looking in from the outside, saw only a lack of progress. They did not understand the painstaking elimination of false positives. They only saw days turning into weeks without a suspect in custody. And as the official investigation ground to a halt, waiting on the slow crawl of complex genetic science, Millions of views have been generated by amateur sleuths analyzing a critical forensic detail, limits by a suspected kidnapper who truly believed they were operating as a ghost. The restless energy of the digital crowd began to mutate into something far more toxic and destructive. When official authorities inevitably withhold of a complex investigation, the digital landscape rapidly floods with relentless and reckless speculation. The online sleuthing community, deeply frustrated by the sheer lack of immediate arrests and the agonizingly slow pace of justice, pivoted their aggressive attention away from the unidentified phantom and locked their digital crosshairs onto the most accessible human target available. They pointed their collective fingers directly at the grieving family. The man who had simply fulfilled his familial duty by ensuring his relative arrived safely at her residence suddenly found himself at the absolute epicenter of a vicious and entirely manufactured digital witch hunt. Unidentified strangers on sprawling internet forums began relentlessly dissecting his every alleged movement, analyzing completely baseless rumors, and convicting an innocent individual in the brutal court of public opinion. This was not just harmless late-night speculation among true crime fans. But nobody is truly a ghost in the modern forensic era. Every physical interaction leaves a trace. It was a highly organized, targeted harassment campaign fueled by an insatiable societal demand for an easily identifiable villain. The situation in the public sphere deteriorated so rapidly and became so incredibly toxic that the highest ranking law enforcement officer in the jurisdiction was forced to publicly intervene. The local sheriff had to step up to a public podium and utilize incredibly precious press conference time to explicitly clear the relatives of any wrongdoing. He definitively and unambiguously stated to the media that absolutely no family members were currently considered suspects in this terrifying disappearance. Law enforcement personnel had to actively divert resources to defend the victim's own relatives from a rabid online mob that claimed to be seeking justice. But the catastrophic damage to the investigation was already cascading through the entire system. While millions of amateur armchair investigators were incredibly busy manufacturing an elaborate domestic dispute narrative, they were simultaneously flooding the dedicated federal tip lines with absolute garbage. Every single baseless theory generated on a social media platform resulted in a phone call or a digital submission that a sworn federal agent had to legally document, process, and investigate to completion. The question is whether our current technology is advanced enough to decode the invisible signature. This overwhelming wave of digital noise completely choked the critical communication channels specifically designed to receive actual, actionable intelligence from the local community. Real individuals with legitimate observations might have been placed on extended hold while dispatchers were forced to listen to internet users excitedly recite fictional theories they had just read on an anonymous message board. The collective impatience of the general public was actively and undeniably sabotaging the very law enforcement professionals who were desperately trying to solve the intricate puzzle. The online community demanded swift justice, but their chaotic behavior was effectively constructing massive administrative roadblocks for the dedicated detectives working the physical streets. We really want to hear your honest thoughts on this specific phenomenon down in the comments below. Do you truly believe amateur online sleuthing actually helps resolve these highly complex mysteries? Or does it inherently destroy the strict analytical process by burying legitimate physical clues under an absolute avalanche of pure fiction? The reality currently facing the Joint Task Force was incredibly stark and deeply frustrating. They were actively fighting a grueling two-front war. On one primary front, they were battling a highly organized, invisible assailant who had successfully vanished into the unforgiving desert landscape, left behind in the dark before time runs out, for a woman who desperately needs to be found. On the secondary front, they were constantly battling an overwhelming onslaught of persistent misinformation generated by people sitting safely behind computer screens thousands of miles away from the actual crime scene. The underlying tension inside the Central Command Center was practically suffocating everyone involved. The seasoned detectives explicitly knew the biological clock was rapidly expiring for the missing woman. They desperately needed a definitive and undeniable scientific breakthrough that would permanently silence the deafening online noise and point a laser directly at the true perpetrator. They needed the microscopic evidence carefully collected weeks ago to finally yield a verifiable name. And while the entire internet was dangerously busy chasing fabricated shadows, the lead investigator deliberately prepared to address the anxious public once more to deliver a harsh scientific reality check that would completely shatter the reigning online narrative and redefine the entire scope of the ongoing federal manhunt. The sheriff meticulously prepared his notes, understanding that his next words needed to completely dismantle the chaotic web of rumors that had infected the public discourse. He knew he had to pivot the attention of the media away from the innocent family members and direct it. An 84-year-old woman living alone in an affluent neighborhood usually implies a quiet, undisturbed routine, squarely back onto the hard, uncompromising science that was currently dictating the pace of their efforts. He was about to pull back the curtain on the most complex biological procedure known to modern forensic investigators. The local sheriff stepped confidently back up to the cluster of microphones on day 80 of the agonizing search to officially address the escalating public chaos and deliver the most significant update of the entire saga. He did not come armed with shiny handcuffs or a dramatic taped confession. He came to set the scientific record completely straight and to decisively crush the rampant misinformation that had hijacked the narrative. His very first order of business was to officially and permanently debunk the massive online legend that had consumed millions of viewers. He firmly clarified to the press that there was absolutely no secret dossier being hidden from the public. He categorically denied the existence of any forgotten suspect documentation that internet communities claimed was inexplicably ignored by federal agents. With that massive conspiracy theory officially destroyed, he introduced the real heavily guarded secret of the investigation. For Nancy Guthrie, that routine was fiercely independent, but medically precarious. He revealed exactly how the federal scientists were planning to untangle the microscopic knot of evidence. The true path forward was utilizing the bleeding edge science of genetic genealogy. The public was desperate for a fast answer, but the authorities explained why this manhunt required the most advanced, meticulously slow biological mapping techniques available, the focus of the intense manhunt shifted entirely away from the physical streets and plunged directly into the vast sprawling branches of human ancestry. The suspect had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal their physical identity covering their face and hands, but they could not possibly conceal the immutable biological code inherited from their ancestors. The federal laboratory was actively taking the meticulously separated genetic markers and running them against massive commercial ancestry databases. They were mathematically hunting for a distant relative who had innocently submitted a saliva swab to build a family tree. Once the scientists identified a relative, they would deploy a team of highly specialized genealogical researchers to slowly build a massive family tree backward through time. They would map out hundreds of individuals, tracing marriages and geographical movements across multiple generations. She possessed a sharp, clear mind that showed absolutely no signs of cognitive decline. Once the massive tree was constructed, they would systematically work their way back down the branches carefully, eliminating relatives based on age, gender, and physical location, until the complex mathematical equation pointed to a single, living, breathing human being who perfectly fit the profile of the individual captured on the security lens. The masked intruder might have believed they were an untraceable ghost operating in the dark, but their own biology had utterly betrayed them. They share a deeply embedded genetic sequence with thousands of distant relatives, and every single one of those relatives is now an unwitting informant working directly for the federal government. The invisible net of forensic science was slowly but inevitably tightening. The authorities were essentially using the perpetrator's own bloodline as the ultimate tracking device. This highly complex scientific process represents the absolute pinnacle of modern investigative techniques. It requires a staggering amount of computational power and an agonizing level of human patience to execute flawlessly. She knew her schedule, she knew her family, and she knew her surroundings perfectly. If you want to closely follow the fascinating progress of this unprecedented genealogical hunt and receive an immediate update, the moment the laboratory secures a definitive familial match, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. The investigators had successfully deployed their most powerful weapon, but it was a weapon that required an enormous amount of time to reach its target. The science of genetic genealogy is fundamentally infallible when executed correctly, but it operates at a glacial pace compared to the urgent, frantic demands of an abduction case. The federal agents knew exactly how to find the suspect, but they also recognized the horrifying reality that the biological clock was ticking down. The scientific breakthrough provided a clear, undeniable path to the ultimate identification of the kidnapper, but it offered absolutely no immediate comfort regarding the current physical location of the missing woman. The tension between the slow, methodical perfection of the laboratory and the rapid degradation of a physical search created an unbearable dynamic. The geneticists were methodically assembling a puzzle that spanned centuries of history, while the tactical teams on the ground were agonizing over every single passing minute. But her physical reality told a very different story. The microscopic evidence promised to deliver the ultimate truth, but it fiercely demanded an agonizing sacrifice of time in return. The ultimate question was no longer if the suspect would be unmasked by their own genetic code, but rather when that final definitive genealogical link would be mathematically confirmed by the researchers. The science was absolute, but the agonizing wait was completely excruciating for a family desperate for answers. While the immense computational power of the federal government slowly ground through millions of ancestral records, the grueling physical reality of the investigation remained fiercely active on the harsh Arizona terrain. The local authorities absolutely refused to simply sit back and passively wait for a laboratory to fax them a name. The sprawling ground search operations for the missing woman continued with relentless determination, expanding outward into increasingly remote and unforgiving sectors of the desert landscape. Highly trained tactical units utilizing specialized tracking canines and aerial thermal imaging systems systematically swept the rugged canyons and dry riverbeds day after grueling day. They were actively hunting for any physical anomaly, a discarded piece of equipment, a disturbed patch of earth, or any. She relied heavily on a cardiac pacemaker to keep her heart beating at a safe rhythm. Microscopic clue that might indicate where the suspect had traveled after leaving the meticulously planned initial scene. Simultaneously, the federal laboratory was not just resting on the ongoing genealogy project. They were aggressively pursuing every available scientific avenue to extract additional data from the scene. The unidentified strands of hair recovered by the crime scene technicians were subjected to incredibly advanced isotope analysis. This specialized chemical process does not look for genetic identity, but rather maps the elemental signatures absorbed from drinking water and local environments over a person's lifetime. The scientists were desperately trying to determine the geographical history of the suspect, attempting to narrow down exactly where this individual had lived, worked, or traveled in the months leading up to the targeted intrusion. They were constructing a precise environmental profile to complement the developing genetic profile. Every single piece of physical material was being squeezed for the maximum amount of actionable data. But despite this monumental deployment of advanced resources and manpower, a dark, sobering reality hung heavy over the entire operational command center. The Federal Bureau of Investigation supposedly missed in a day 79 suspect profile. She required a strict daily regimen of specific medications just to maintain her baseline health. The technological brilliance of the genetic mapping and the sheer physical dedication of the search teams could not alter the fundamental biological vulnerability of the victim. The agonizing truth remained that a senior citizen requiring daily critical medications was out there completely separated from her life-sustaining resources. The majestic, sprawling landscape of the Southwest is notoriously unforgiving to anyone exposed to its elements, and that danger is magnified exponentially for someone with pre-existing medical vulnerabilities. The passage of time was not just a frustrating administrative delay for the detectives. It was an active, escalating threat to the victim's survival. The sophisticated genealogical search might take several more grueling months to confidently produce a verified target name. The intricate isotope mapping of the hair strands might take weeks to generate a geographical hotspot. These scientific methods are historically proven to be incredibly accurate and fundamentally sound, but they are inherently completely divorced from the urgent ticking clock of a rescue mission. The federal agents are essentially racing an incredibly slow, infallible machine against an incredibly fast, deteriorating biological reality. Her mobility was highly restricted, making even simple movements around her own property a calculated effort. The case has officially transformed into a brutal test of endurance, where the absolute certainty of eventual scientific identification is violently clashing with the immediate, horrifying uncertainty of the victim's current state. The authorities possess the ultimate keys to unlocking the identity of the perpetrator, but they remain completely blind to the geographical location of the prize they are actually trying to recover. The machinery of justice is slowly turning its massive gears, locking onto a target hidden somewhere in the vast human family tree. The genetic ghost will inevitably be given a name, a face, and a permanent criminal record. The science guarantees that the suspect will eventually face the full, terrifying weight of the federal legal system. Yet, as the days turn into weeks, and the weeks threaten to bleed into months, one agonizing question remains, completely unresolved, and hangs over every single laboratory update and every single tactical briefing. When the federal agents finally print out the name of the kidnapper and kick down their door, will they be initiating a deeply complex? She was not someone who could simply wander off into the desert night on a whim. Rescue operation, or will they be arriving far too late to do anything other than begin a devastatingly tragic recovery effort? What this intricate case critically teaches us about the underlying fragility of modern criminal investigations is incredibly profound and deeply unsettling. We are currently witnessing a completely unprecedented era where the sheer velocity of digital communication actively threatens to derail the methodical pursuit of legal justice. This specific manhunt serves as the ultimate sociological case study, illustrating exactly how a well-intentioned digital crowd can rapidly mutate into an incredibly destructive force. When an online community arbitrarily elevates completely unverified rumors over documented forensic realities, they do not just spread harmless gossip, they actively weaponize misinformation, causing severe psychological trauma to innocent individuals and directly obstructing sworn officers by completely suffocating vital intelligence networks. This phenomenon presents a massive threat to overall community safety because it forces highly trained resources away from hunting actual predators and redirects them toward managing public relations crises. There is a very specific, actionable lesson you must take away from observing this ongoing digital catastrophe. You must learn to aggressively insulate yourself against the trial by internet mentality. She was a woman who needed the controlled environment of her home to survive. The definitive warning sign of a fabricated narrative is its underlying source material. If a sensational claim regarding a suspect or a crucial piece of evidence does not directly originate from a formal indictment, a sworn legal affidavit, an official agency press release, or a verified public court docket, there is an overwhelming mathematical probability that the information is pure, dangerous speculation. True forensic science operates entirely on verified physical data and rigorous peer-reviewed methodologies. It absolutely never operates on anonymous tips gathered from social media comment sections. We must collectively demand a significantly higher standard of critical thinking when consuming true crime content. The integrity of our entire justice system fundamentally relies on our ability to separate emotional outrage from empirical evidence. The advanced genetic sequence is currently locked inside a federal database, and mathematical algorithms do not know how to lie. They simply require an agonizing amount of unbroken time to properly articulate the undeniable truth. Our dedicated research team will continue to heavily monitor the official judicial dockets, and we will immediately, on the evening of January 31st, 2026, that controlled environment seemed completely secure, release a comprehensive analytical breakdown the exact second the laboratory successfully identifies the target. We refuse to engage in baseless speculation while we wait for the hard science to deliver the final conclusive verdict. The profound patience required for this specific investigation stands in massive stark contrast to the incredibly chaotic narrative we are preparing to examine next. Join us next week as we aggressively tear open a deeply disturbing cold case file where highly respected experts actively manipulated physical data to intentionally frame an innocent person. We will meticulously explore what actually happens to the system when the forensic evidence itself is carefully weaponized to tell a devastating lie. Ensure you have your channel notifications permanently activated so you do not miss that incredible breakdown. The truth is always buried in the details, and we will find it. At approximately 10:50 at night, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drove her back to her residence in the Catalina foothills of Tucson. He watched her go inside, ensuring she was safely back in her sanctuary. He had absolutely no reason to suspect anything was out of the ordinary. The neighborhood was quiet, the house was locked, and the routine was completely normal. He drove away believing his mother-in-law was protected by the walls of her home. The online community is entirely convinced that federal agents simply overlooked a glaring piece of evidence staring them right in the face. But the Catalina foothills area, despite its affluence, had a fatal flaw in its security infrastructure. The sprawling properties and disconnected private security systems created vast, quiet blind spots. There were long stretches of darkness between the illuminated porches. Tommaso looked at the closed door and saw safety. He could not see the massive vulnerability built into the geography of the neighborhood itself. He did not know that the perceived safety of this quiet community was merely an illusion waiting to be shattered. He drove back to his own life, leaving an 84-year-old medically fragile woman entirely alone. The quiet of the Catalina foothills was not a protective blanket. It was a perfectly designed stage for someone who wanted to operate without being seen. The geographic isolation that provided peace and quiet during the daylight hours transformed into an immense tactical advantage for an intruder once the sun went down. There is just one massive problem with this wildly popular theory. That profile does not exist. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped and the neighborhood went completely silent. The security systems monitored the front doors, but they could not monitor the vast empty spaces surrounding the properties. A boundary was about to be crossed, and the very environment that was supposed to offer an elderly woman peace was actively shielding the person stepping into her blind spot. Nancy settled into her evening routine, completely unaware that her physical limitations were being factored into a sinister equation. She navigated her quiet house, relying on the familiar layout that accommodated her restricted mobility. Every step she took was a testament to her determination to remain independent despite the heavy reliance on her daily medications and her pacemaker. But that independence was fragile. It hung on the assumption that the outside world would remain outside. The affluent isolation of the Tucson foothills meant that if something went wrong there, were no immediate neighbors walking by, no street traffic to deter an approaching threat. It is a complete fabrication born from the echo chambers of social media and amplified by headline chasers looking to profit from an ongoing tragedy. The silence was absolute. And in that silence, the illusion of her perfectly secure fortress was slowly, systematically dissolving. The closed door that her son-in-law had found so reassuring was nothing more than a temporary physical barrier against a threat that had already bypassed the neighborhood defenses. The night crept forward, ticking closer to an event that would completely dismantle the peace of the Catalina foothills and throw a frantic spotlight on a vulnerable woman left alone in the dark. The first sign that the carefully maintained routine had collapsed came the very next day. It was around noon on Sunday, February 1st, 2026. Nancy was scheduled to attend her regular church service, which she actively participated in through an online stream. For a woman with her sharp mental clarity and strict adherence to her schedule, missing this service was an immediate flashing red light. She did not log on. She did not answer her phone. The authorities did not release any such document. The sudden silence was deafening, and it prompted her family to immediately contact the authorities to report her missing. When investigators arrived at the property in the Catalina foothills, the initial quiet of the scene was highly deceptive. The house stood still, but the digital eyes guarding the front door had captured a chilling sequence of events from the dark hours of the previous night. The authorities pulled the footage from the doorbell camera and watched the illusion of safety evaporate. Sometime during the night, between the late hours of January 31st and the early morning of February 1st, a figure emerged from the blind spots of the neighborhood. The camera lens caught a suspect moving with calculated intent. The individual was dressed entirely in black clothing designed to absorb the shadows. Their face was completely obscured by a ski mask hiding any identifiable features from the lens. Their hands were covered by dark gloves, ensuring no immediate fingerprints would be left on the hardware. Here at Ellis Case Reports, we do not deal in internet rumors or manufactured outrage. Strapped to their body was an Ozark Trail hiker pack, specifically the 25-liter model, suggesting they came prepared to carry out items or perhaps tools. Even more alarming, the footage revealed a handgun holster secured to the suspect, elevating the situation from a simple break-in to an armed home invasion involving an extremely vulnerable 84-year-old target. The suspect did not just walk up to the door. They actively engaged with the security system, attempting to physically disable the camera to blind the only digital witness on the property. The footage abruptly cut to black. The visual timeline was severed. Investigators were left staring at a dark screen, knowing that somewhere in those unrecorded moments, Nancy was taken from her home completely against her will. The armed suspect had successfully breached the sanctuary. They had silenced the camera and dragged a woman who relied on a pacemaker into the cold unknown. But as the authorities transitioned from watching the screen to physically examining the front porch, they found the first crack in the perpetrator's careful plan. We read the actual court documents and we cross-verify every single claim. The suspect thought they had sanitized the scene by destroying the digital record. They believed they had operated as a ghost, slipping in and out of the Catalina foothills without leaving a trace. However, they had forgotten the most fundamental rule of crime scene investigation. Locard's exchange principle dictates that the perpetrator of a crime will bring something into the crime scene and leave with something from it. Every contact leaves a trace. And right there on the concrete of the porch, stark against the daylight, was a physical trace the suspect could not erase. It was a smear of blood. The digital witness had been blinded, but the biological evidence remained. The suspect had made a critical physical error during the breach or the extraction. They took away the video, but they left behind the very building blocks of identity. The investigation immediately pivoted from a missing persons search to a frantic forensic collection effort. The physical trace on the porch was the only tangible link to the phantom in the ski mask.